Was Giorno really that strong? Before his awakening, Giorno can already be considered one of the smartest characters in the series. However, what most people remember him for is the form he attained after using the arrow, Gold Experience Requiem. To this day, there seems to be an ongoing debate surrounding its abilities, whether the power is passive or not, how it interacts with time, and especially the role of fate, whether Giorno still possesses GR after part 5, and ultimately, if it makes him the strongest in the series. We'll be going over all of it. But before that, if you like this content, the goal is 20k, so if you enjoy, sub up. To start, let's briefly touch on GER's abilities. As stated in the stats section, it returns all of an opponent's attacking actions and even the power of their will to 0. One major misconception is that people assume both action and will need to be present simultaneously for this to apply, but that is not what the Japanese says here. The wording uses dosaya ishi, and the ya here is just a loose listing particle and is not functioning like a condition that requires both, which the official English translation actually clarifies, but let's back this up with actual evidence. In JoJo, GER is described as possessing the ultimate ability to neutralize an opponent's attacking actions or will. Another guidebook entry also explains that the Requiem power enhanced by the arrow cannot be compared to any existing stands by the same standards, and that its ability to reduce any will or power to 0 is something that even Giorno himself is unaware of. So in simple terms, across all these descriptions, anyone opposing GER can never reach the state of 1. No matter what they attempt, they're always forced back to 0 as if nothing ever happened. However, even after understanding this, another question naturally arises. How far do these abilities actually apply? Can they influence space and time, or even the causality behind fate itself? To answer that, we need to take a step back and look at King Crimson and the role fate plays in this entire system. First, we need to understand one of the core ideas Araki keeps returning to throughout JoJo, fate. In JoJo, fate is a real governing force that exists above the characters, and one they move within whether they realize it or not. The clearest proof of that comes at the very end of part 5 in the epilogue, Sleeping Slaves. Araki deliberately places it after Diavolo is already defeated, as it allows us to look back on the events of part 5 and understand the law that was hanging over everything from the start. A key example of that is Rolling Stone, as it appears before those fated to die and craves their death into stone. And even if the stone is destroyed, fate does not change, because what it recorded was never contingent to begin with, which is closer to philosophical fatalism than simple determinism. It's not that every cause leads necessarily forward, it's that the end is fixed regardless of the path taken. Abbacchio, Narancia, and Bucciarati were always going to die. The only thing that trying to interfere with the rock revealed was how thoroughly set their deaths were from the start. So this confirms that characters do in fact exist in a fatalistic world. A theme Araki was trying to convey throughout part 5 was fate versus free will, which also fits the idea. But why does any of that matter for explaining how King Crimson works? Because King Crimson's ability is inseparable from one of JoJo's core ideas, fate, or in the language a series later uses, gravity. On the surface, King Crimson sounds simple. It erases up to around 10 seconds of time. During that erase interval, everyone except Diavolo continues moving along the path fate had already laid out for them, but they do so unconsciously. Once the skip ends, they have no memory of what they just did. To them, reality simply just jumps forward, as if the middle was just deleted and only the result remained. Diavolo, however, is free to move and reposition during time skip. The major limitation and point that makes this so confusing is that he cannot interact with anything during that erased time. He phases through objects and attacks pass through him, and in the eyes of fate, he is non-existent. That's why in the Risotto fight, Earosmi's bullet goes straight through him during the skip. However, this is where Epitaph becomes the key to the whole ability. Epitaph shows a future that is 100% fated to happen. It's like a mini version of Rolling Stones. Diavolo has no control over what appears in that vision, so when he activates King Crimson, he's erasing the interval after already seeing where those next few seconds were going to end, while removing himself from that sequence entirely. But this is where the confusion starts, as it becomes paradoxical, and exactly why I explained the role of fate beforehand. If Epitaph shows a future in which Diavolo was meant to perform an action, what happens when he skips time? He can't interact with anything during the skip, so the cause of that action no longer exists. And yet, if the action was part of the fated future Epitaph showed, its result still has to happen. That is a terrifying part of King Crimson. Imagine Epitaph shows Diavolo snatching a knife off a table and throwing it across the room. The future is fixed. But then he activates King Crimson, and now he can't grab the knife and can't throw it. The root cause of it is gone. Yet the knife still ends up where it was fated to go, because in JoJo, fate is an active force that acts like gravity, pulling people, objects, and events along their destined path. Even when the ordinary cause is removed from lived reality, the effect still resolves, an effect without a cause, sustained purely by fate. Once you understand that, the rest of the ability becomes much easier to follow. Take the boat scene. Every time Diavolo activates King Crimson, Giorno's group loses all memory of what they were doing, but their actions still complete themselves. Narancia accuses Mista of eating the chocolates, even though they were already in Narancia's own mouth. Fugo is already drinking the water Giorno had been handing him. Their bodies follow the course fate set for them, even though they never consciously experienced it. The elevator scene works on the same principle, and this is where people often explain it badly. The mistake is saying Diavolo simply attacked Triss during the erased time, which clashes with the rule that he can interact while the skip is active. The better reading is that the future Diavolo saw already included Triss losing her hand and being taken. That was a fixed endpoint. By skipping time, Diavolo simply didn't have to be visible during the process. When the skip ends, the result is already there. The hotel scene follows the same logic. The maid enters and Diavolo and the luggage are already gone. Normally, she would have seen him gather his things and leave, but once time is erased, the movement of objects still resolves. That was a fated path. What disappears is only the visible process. The risotto scene shows a rule from the other side. When Aerosmith's bullets are about to hit both Diavolo and Risotto, Diavolo erases a split second. The bullets pass through him but continue along the fated path and hit Risotto. This scene is crucial because it proves both sides at once. Diavolo escapes what's about to happen to him, but he cannot stop the rest of reality from reaching its destined result. And more importantly, he did not use Epitaph in that moment, which means there was no fixed movement for him, allowing the bullets to phase through him. And that is why Epitaph matters so much. Without it, King Crimson is just time erasure or time skip. With it, Diavolo sees the endpoint fate has chosen even for him, then erases the interval in which everyone else would have consciously experienced reaching it. Gravity carries the world into that result anyway. So when people say King Crimson makes no sense, the real answer is that it only makes sense in a world where fate is so powerful that removing a cause doesn't prevent the effect. But you might be thinking, isn't this meant to be a video about Giorno? It is, but it's important to understand just how powerful Return to Zero is, because it surpasses this entire concept of fate I've been building up to this point. Getting into the details of Revert to Zero, let's walk through the scene in which it actually plays out, because some people have interpreted this as Ghirga only activating his ability after King Crimson's time erase had already ended, under the assumption that Ghirga can only respond to a direct attack, but that reading is entirely wrong. We first see King Crimson activate time erase after Mista fires his bullets, and Diavolo explains the logic of it, which we just covered. But what matters here is a projection from Epitaph. Diavolo states that the truth, the 100% guaranteed result, is that Giorno will be defeated, and Epitaph shows King Crimson ripping out Giorno's heart. This projection appears multiple times during the time erase. But for those wondering why Ghirga didn't react to the blood Diavolo placed on Giorno and Ghirga's eyes, Diavolo later says, "Your eyes will never be able to see myself and King Crimson again." What this tells us is that Diavolo is simply waiting for the fated action to play out, since he doesn't need to interfere with something that will 100% happen on its own. But by letting it resolve, Giorno will also be blinded by the blood Diavolo placed there, blood that was positioned to land once the time skip finishes. So it's a double action from Diavolo, the kill and the blinding, both set up within the same time skip. But the truly crazy part of the scene comes next. Even though Epitaph still shows the truth as Giorno being defeated, things start reverting back to the moment Diavolo willed to act. The birds, the leaves, even Mista's bullets, all the movements that were bound by fate begin rewinding. And yet Epitaph still shows Diavolo winning. So how is this possible? Diavolo himself is confused, wondering if he's dreaming, but that can't be the case, since only Diavolo can move within the time he erased, and is essentially non-existent to the real world. But Ghirga answers this directly for us. He acknowledges that what Diavolo is seeing is the truth. The fate that was meant to play out was real. However, he tells Diavolo, you will never arrive at that truth, regardless of your ability. The implication is that even if fate itself, the very law of the universe, is on Diavolo's side, it is meaningless in front of Requiem. And that's what makes Ghirga so terrifying to fully grasp. We just spent all this time establishing that fate in JoJo is so powerful it can sustain effects even when their cores are erased, and Revert to Zero simply negates that. But in my opinion, that's not even the most terrifying part. As I stated at the beginning, Ghirga was already active the moment Diavolo willed to act. Let's play it through again. When Diavolo is experiencing Revert to Zero, we see him confused. He can see his own past actions replaying in this realm, but the key detail is what it replays. The moment he told Giorno, "I won't give you the chance to regret your own death." That line is deeply ironic because from the objective worldview, from the perspective of everyone else, Diavolo never actually said this. It was only his will to act, and that ties back to what I explained earlier. Ghirga doesn't wait for an attack. Whether it's your will, your power, or your action, whichever comes first becomes a trigger for it to revert to zero. That's also why Diavolo says, "I haven't moved from the start." The trigger for revert to zero wasn't a punch and wasn't King Crimson's time erase, it was that line, the mere intention to act. So yes, regardless of your speed, your power, or even if fate itself is on your side, you will never get the chance to even act, to turn the 0 into a 1 in front of Ghirga. Now, the last argument as to why people believe Ghirga is still weaker than the other stands comes down to two things: recent information from Araki and statements about Star Platinum. Let's start with Star Platinum. The first claim comes from part 6, where Star Platinum is called the strongest stand ability ever. The second is from an Araki Q&A, suggesting that Star Platinum is above Gold Experience Requiem. On the surface, these sound somewhat convincing, but they all fall apart on a closer look. For the part 6 statement, a basic understanding of what Ghirga actually does should be enough to see the issue, but for those who still hold on to it, consider the statement we already covered, that Ghirga cannot be compared to any existing stand by the same standards. Star Platinum already existed when that was written. So what this tells us is that when Araki made the part 6 claim about Star Platinum, he may have not measured it against something like Ghirga, a stand he himself stated operates outside the usual framework of comparison entirely. The strongest stand label only applies within the pool of stands that can be compared by conventional standards, and Ghirga was explicitly excluded from that pool. Or there's an argument to say that Ghirga didn't exist in part 6, but that's for a later video. As for my second point, if the tier list itself is meant to be taken as the 100% truth, then we also have to face the fact that Killer Queen is placed higher than Ghirga and in the same tier as Star Platinum, which no one would seriously argue means Killer Queen is stronger than Gold Experience Requiem. However, what's most convincing for me that Ghirga is above Star Platinum literally just lies within his abilities, as anyone who has the will to attack Ghirga would automatically be reverted to 0, so even if Star Platinum wanted to use Time Stop, that action itself wouldn't be made in the objective worldview, since it was a will to attack Ghirga, and that is essentially what Giorno's POV would look like. Or a super gigawank interpretation would be that Star Platinum itself scales higher than the concept of fate and above the concept that governs that fate as well, but that wouldn't explain why it was affected by Maiden Heaven, so it doesn't really work out. However, for people who argue Ghirga can simply be blitzed, sure, if something operates passively without a will, you can, that argument can still apply. But Ghirga itself has a strong case of even being baseline in measurable speed. Under Versus Battle Wiki standard, that means acting beyond linear time. Which circles back to Diavolo, which I already bombarded you all about his time erase, stepping outside the chain of linear time, space, and even fate. Ghirga operates independently of the temporal and fated framework King Crimson relies on. Even its stand stats support that portrayal as well, being listed as none, which reinforces the idea that Ghirga stands beyond normal measurement, with infinite even being a measurable factor according to Araki. But to answer this video's question, was Giorno really that strong? Yes, Ghirga is easily one of the hardest abilities in JoJo, let alone fiction, to deal with. Its ability to nullify actions, will, and even the very power of fate behind an outcome makes it absurdly oppressive. But was he the strongest? Honestly, he probably would have been. Well, only if there wasn't a stand ability that could passively respond to the very intent or thought of attacking its user and automatically trigger a casual chain that leads to the attacker's defeat. Yeah, probably not.